People who feel invisible in groups rarely arrive at that feeling by accident. In most cases, it is the result of early psychological conditioning. Somewhere in childhood or adolescence, they learned quietly and repeatedly that speaking did not lead to connection. Their words were interrupted, dismissed, overlooked, or met with emotional indifference. Over time, the psyche adapts. Expression begins to feel risky, while silence feels safe. This is not weakness. It is a survival strategy. The mind learns to withdraw not because it lacks something to say, but because experience has taught it that being heard is uncertain. As this pattern deepens, silence becomes automatic. The individual does not consciously choose to disappear. They simply stop stepping forward. Their presence becomes small, controlled, careful. In group settings, they wait for permission that never comes, and slowly the inner voice starts to fade, not because it is gone, but because it has been trained to remain hidden. From a psychological perspective, this is how invisibility is formed, not through lack of value, but through learned restraint. The tragedy is not that these individuals have nothing to contribute, but that they were taught their contribution did not matter. What was learned in silence can be unlearned through awareness. The moment you recognize this pattern, invisibility begins to lose its power. Over time, many people who feel invisible in groups unconsciously adopt what can be called the observer identity. They sit slightly outside the circle, not physically, but psychologically. They listen more than they speak, analyze more than they participate. At first, this role feels intelligent, even mature. Observing gives a sense of control. When you do not speak, you cannot be judged. When you do not act, you cannot fail. But what begins as protection slowly becomes confinement. From a Jungian perspective, the psyche seeks balance, and when expression is consistently withheld, energy turns inward. The observer becomes highly perceptive, often understanding group dynamics better than anyone else in the room. Yet this insight remains unshared. The individual becomes present but unseen, involved but unacknowledged. Over time, this creates a subtle fracture within the self, the part that knows and the part that dares to show. The danger of the observer identity is not passivity, it is disconnection. When you only watch life, you begin to feel as though you are not fully part of it. The world moves forward, conversations continue, decisions are made, and you remain on the edge of your own experience. Awareness is the turning point. The observer must eventually step into participation, not to be loud, but to be real. You are not here to watch life happen. You are here to be part of it. When a person feels invisible in groups, their attention rarely turns inward. Instead, it sharpens outward. They become deeply attuned to the emotional climate of the room, who is uncomfortable, who needs reassurance, who must be handled carefully. This hyper-awareness of others is not accidental. It is learned. When your own presence feels uncertain, monitoring the environment becomes a form of safety. You anticipate reactions before they happen. You adjust yourself to fit the moment, and slowly you begin to disappear behind that adjustment. Psychologically, this creates an imbalance. The individual becomes fluent in empathy, but unfamiliar with self-expression. They know what others feel, yet struggle to identify what they themselves want or need. Their inner life becomes quiet not because it lacks depth, but because it has been consistently postponed. In Jungian terms, the self is sacrificed in service of harmony, and the cost is authenticity. This pattern often earns praise. Such people are called considerate, easygoing, emotionally intelligent, but beneath that surface is exhaustion. To constantly prioritize others is to live without an internal center. Over time, resentment may form, not toward others, but toward oneself for never speaking up. Reclaiming visibility begins with a simple but radical shift, turning attention back inward. If you can sense everyone else in the room, you can also learn to sense yourself. And the moment you do, your presence begins to return. At the core of invisibility in groups is a quiet but powerful belief, the fear of taking up space. For many, this fear is not conscious. It exists as a feeling, a hesitation just before speaking, a tightening in the chest when attention turns toward them. Somewhere along the way, they absorbed the idea that being noticeable is disruptive, that their presence might inconvenience others or draw unwanted judgment. So they learn to shrink, not physically, but psychologically. From a Jungian lens, this is the ego learning to protect itself by minimizing expression. The individual becomes careful with words, cautious with opinions, restrained in emotion. They speak only when invited, contribute only when absolutely certain, and even then, they soften their presence to avoid standing out. This creates an inner contradiction, a rich inner world held captive by the fear of visibility. The tragedy is that the psyche does not thrive in containment. Energy that cannot move outward turns inward, often appearing as self, doubt or chronic hesitation. Life begins to feel distant, as if happening to others. The person is present, yet not fully alive within the moment. Growth begins when this belief is questioned. Taking up space is not an act of aggression. It is an act of honesty. You do not need to be louder, only more real. The moment you stop apologizing for existing, the world begins to make room for you. What remains unseen in the psyche does not disappear. It retreats into what Carl Jung called the shadow. For those who feel invisible in groups, the shadow often holds not darkness, but potential unspoken ideas, creative impulses, leadership instincts, and emotional truth that were never given permission to emerge. When expression is repeatedly withheld, these parts of the self do not dissolve, they accumulate. Over time, this inner pressure seeks an outlet. It may surface as quiet frustration, a sense of being misunderstood, or a lingering feeling that life is being lived at a distance. The individual may watch others speak confidently and feel a strange mixture of admiration and resentment, not because those people are doing something wrong, but because they are doing something familiar that the self was denied. This is the shadow asking to be seen. From a psychological standpoint, ignoring this inner material is costly. The more the shadow is avoided, the stronger it becomes, shaping moods, relationships, and self-image from behind the scenes. Invisibility in groups is often not a lack of presence, but an excess of suppressed presence. Integration is the turning point. When a person begins to express what was hidden gradually, imperfectly, the shadow loses its grip. What was once a source of tension becomes a source of strength. Your unseen self is not your enemy. It is your unfinished work, and the courage to face it is the first step toward becoming whole. Visibility does not begin in the eyes of others. It begins in the relationship you have with yourself. Many people wait for recognition before they allow themselves to speak, contribute, or take up space. But psychologically, this order is reversed. You must first recognize yourself. In Jungian terms, this means integrating the parts of the psyche that were once silenced and standing in alignment with your inner truth, even when no external validation is guaranteed. When self-recognition takes root, behavior changes naturally. You speak not to impress, but to express. You participate not to be noticed, but because you belong. This shift is subtle, yet powerful. Others sense it. Presence has a quality that cannot be forced, but it can be cultivated. It comes from congruence between inner experience and outer action. Reclaiming visibility is not about becoming dominant or extroverted. It is about allowing your inner life to move outward without apology. The psyche seeks wholeness, not approval, and when you honor that impulse, you no longer vanish in groups. You arrive. This is how invisibility dissolves, not through performance, but through alignment, not through demand, but through self-trust. The final truth is simple and demanding. The world can only meet you as deeply as you are willing to meet yourself. Step forward, not when you feel ready, but because your presence is already overdue.